Hey y'all, we're gonna do a quick reading this morning. Is it even still morning? What time is it? No, it's not morning, it's afternoon. So we're gonna do a quick reading this afternoon. I'm doing it personally in part because it's not that long. It's not a long book, if you will. It's very old. It's the record of a slave auction that took place in 1859. So not long before the purported emancipation of the slaves, and it has the distinction, if you will, of being one of the, if not the largest slave auction that was recorded in this fashion, right? So what I'm going to do before I get started is I will share the video very quickly. I hope you'll do the same. Let me just find it here on my timeline. I love you, by the way. If you didn't get my message yet for the morning, I'm loving you all day. Alright, where's this video? So that I can share it. There it is. Alright, so I'm sharing the video. Please do share as well. So what is the difference between start a watch party and share in a group? I don't even know. Thank you, Lauren. That's what's up. That's what's up. There can never be too much love. You know what I'm saying? Especially in our community, right? Like, they've thrown so much hate at us that it actually takes extra effort, if you will, to do what's supposed to come naturally. It's a shame. Alright, so I think, shared to the most important places. Shout out to MBK, by the way. And we will get started. Come, don't freeze up on me now. Alrighty. Good stuff. Alright, so I'll get right into the reading. Enjoy. Alrighty. Sale of slaves. The largest sale of human chattels that has been made in star-spangled America for several years took place on Wednesday and Thursday of last week at the racecourse near the city of Savannah, Georgia. The lot consisted of 436 men, women, children, and infants, being that half of the Negro stock remaining on the old Major Butler plantations, which fell to one of the two heirs to that state. Major Butler, dying, left a property valued at more than $1 million, the major part of which was invested in rice and cotton plantations, and the slaves thereon, all of which immense fortune descended to two heirs, his sons, Mr. John A. Butler, sometime deceased, and Mr. Pierce M. Butler, still living and resident in the city of Philadelphia in the Free State of Pennsylvania. Losses in the great crash of 1857 through 58 and other exigencies of business have compelled the latter gentleman to realize on his southern investments that he may satisfy his pressing creditors. This necessity led to a partition of the Negro stock on the Georgia plantation between himself and the representative of the other heir, the widow of the late John A. Butler. And the Negroes that were brought to the hammer last week were the property of Mr. Pierce M. Butler of Philadelphia, and were in fact sold to pay Mr. Pierce M. Butler's debts. The creditors were represented by General Cadwallader, while Mr. Butler was present in person, attended by his business agent to attend to his own interests. The sale had been advertised largely, broadly, for many weeks, though the name of Mr. Butler was not mentioned, and as the Negroes were known to be a choice lot and very desirable property, the attendance of buyers was large. The breaking up of an old family estate is so uncommon an occurrence that the affair was regarded with unusual interest throughout the South. For several days before the sale, every hotel in Savannah, Georgia, was crowded with Negro speculators from North and South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, Alabama, and Louisiana, who'd been attracted hither by the prospects of making good bargains. Nothing was heard for days in the bar rooms and public rooms but talk of the great sale, criticisms of the business affairs of Mr. Butler, and speculations as to the probable prices the stock would bring. The office of Joseph Bryan, the Negro broker, who had the management of the sale, was thronged every day by eager inquirers in search of information, and by some who were anxious to buy, but were uncertain as to whether their securities would prove acceptable. Little parties were made up from the various hotels every day to visit the race course, distant some 3 miles from the city, to look over the chattels, discuss their points, and make memoranda for guidance on the day of sale. So you get to inspect the goods before the auction begins, right? The buyers were generally of a rough breed, slangy, profane, and bearish, being for the most part from the back river and swamp plantations, where the elegancies of polite life are not, perhaps, developed to their fullest extent. In fact, the humanities are sadly neglected by the petty tyrants of the rice fields that border the great dismal swamp. Their knowledge of the luxuries of our best society, comprehending only revolvers and kindred delicacies. Your correspondent was present at an early date, but as he easily anticipated the touching welcome that would, at such a time, be officiously extended to a representative of the Tribune, and being a modest man withal, and not desiring to be the recipient of a public demonstration from the enthusiastic Southern population, who at times overdo their hospitality and their guests, he did not placard his mission and claim his honors. Although he kept his business in the background, he made himself a prominent figure in the picture. And wherever there was anything going on, there was he in the midst. At the sale might have been seen a busy individual, armed with pencil and catalog, doing his little utmost to keep up all the appearance of a knowing buyer, pricing likely nigger fellas, talking confidentially to the smartest Eben maids, chucking the round-eyed youngsters under the chin, making an occasional bid for a large family. A low bid, though, so low that somebody would almost instantly raise him $25 when the busy man would ignominiously retreat, and otherwise conducting himself like a rich planter, with $40,000 where he could put his finger on it. This gentleman was much condoled with by some sympathizing persons when the particularly fine lot on which he had fixed his eye was sold and lost to him forever, because he happened to be downstairs at lunch at just the interesting moment. Where the Negroes came from. The Negroes came from 2 plantations. The one, a rice plantation near Darien, in the state of Georgia, not far from the great Okeechobee swamp, and the other, a cotton plantation on the extreme northern point of St. Simon's Island, a little bit of an island in the Atlantic, cut off from Georgia mainland by a slender arm of the sea. Though most of the stock had been accustomed to only rice and cotton planting, there were among them a number of very passable mechanics who had been taught to do all the rougher sorts of mechanical work on the plantations. There were coopers, carpenters, shoemakers, and blacksmiths, each one equal in his various craft to the ordinary requirements of a plantation. Thus, the coopers could make rice tierces and possibly on a pinch rude tubs and buckets. The carpenter could do the rough carpentry about the Negro quarters. and the shoemaker could make shoes of the fashion required for the slaves. And the blacksmith was adequate to the manufacture of hoes and similar tools, and to such trifling repairs in the blacksmithing way as did not require too refined a skill. Though probably no one of all these would be called a superior or even an average workman among the masters of the craft, their knowledge of these various trades sold, in some cases, for nearly as much as the man. That is, a man without a trade, who would be valued at $900, would readily bring $1,600 or $1,700 if he was a passable blacksmith. Now, I'll pause here just to say that in reading this before I brought it to you, I took a moment to look up what $1,859 would be equal to today. And it's about $52,000. So between $52,000 and $53,000 for a quality blacksmith or cooper versus, I guess, $25,000, $26,000, $27,000 for an ordinary slave. So when you see somebody has 400 slaves, you do the math, right? There were no light mulattoes in the whole lot of the Butler stock, but very few that were even a shade removed from the original Congo blackness. They've been little defiled by the admixture of degenerate Anglo-Saxon blood, and for the most part could boast that they were of as pure a breed as the best blood of Spain, a point in their favor in the eyes of a buyer, as well as physiologically. For too liberal an infusion of the blood of the dominant race, it brings a larger intelligence, a more vigorous brain, which will grow restless under the yoke, and would be prone to inquire into the definition of the word liberty, and the meaning of the starry flag which waves, as you may have heard, over the land of the free. The pure-blooded Negroes are much more docile and manageable than mulattoes, though less quick of comprehension, which makes them preferred by drivers who can stimulate stupidity much easier than they can control intelligence by the lash. None of the Butler slaves have ever been sold before, but have been on these two plantations since they were born. Here they've lived their humble lives and loved their simple loves. Here were they born, and here have many of them had children born unto them. Here had their parents lived before them, and are now resting in quiet graves on the old plantation that these unhappy ones are to see no more forever. Here they left not only the well-known scenes dear to them from very babyhood by 1,000 fond memories, and homes as much loved by them, perhaps as brighter homes by men of brighter faces, but all the clinging ties that bound them to living hearts were torn asunder, for but one half of each of these two happy little communities was sent to the shambles, to be scattered to the four winds, and the other half was left behind. And who can tell how closely intertwined are the affections of a little band of 400 persons, living isolated from all the world beside, from birth to middle age? Do they not naturally become one great family, each man a brother unto each? It's true they were sold in families, but let's see. A man and his wife were called a family. Their parents and kindred were not taken into account. The man and wife might be sold to the pine woods of North Carolina, the brothers and sisters be scattered through the cotton fields of Alabama and the rice swamps of Louisiana, while the parents might be left on the old plantation to wear out their weary lives in heavy grief, and lay their heads in far-off graves over which their children might never weep. And no account could be taken of loves that were as yet unconsummated by marriage, and how many aching hearts have been divorced by this summary proceeding no man can ever know. And the separation is as utter and is infinitely more hopeless than that made by the angel of death. For then the loved ones are committed to the care, at least, of a merciful God. But in the other instance, to the tender mercies of a slave driver. These dark-skinned unfortunates are perfectly unlettered and couldn't communicate by writing even if they knew where to send their missives. And so to each other and to the old familiar places of their youth clung all their sympathies and affections, not less strong perhaps, because they're so few. The blades of grass on all the Butler estates are outnumbered by the tears that are poured out in agony at the wreck that has been wrought in happy homes, and the crushing grief that's been laid on loving hearts. But then, what business have niggers with tears? Besides, didn't Pierce Butler give them a silver dollar apiece? Which will appear in the sequel. As sad as it is, it was all necessary because a gentleman was not able to live on the beggarly pittance of $500,000 and so must enter into speculations, which turned out adversely. How were they treated in Savannah? Well, the Negroes were brought to Savannah in small lots, as many at a time as could be conveniently taken care of, the last of them reaching the city Friday before the sale. They were consigned to the care of Mr. J. Bryan, auctioneer and Negro broker, who was to feed and keep them in condition until disposed of. Immediately on their arrival, they were taken to the racecourse and there quartered in the sheds erected for the accommodation of the horses and carriages of gentlemen attending the races. Into these sheds they were huddled pell-mell without any more attention to their comfort than was necessary to prevent their becoming ill and unsaleable. Each family had one or more boxes or bundles in which were stowed such scanty articles of their clothing as were not brought into immediate requisition, their tin dishes, their gourds for their food and drink. It's perhaps a fit tribute to large-handed munificence to say that when the Negro man was sold, there was no extra charge for the Negro man's clothes. They went with the man and weren't charged in the bill. Nor is this altogether a contemptible idea, for many of them had worldly wealth in the shape of clothing and other valuables to the extent of perhaps $4 or $5. And had all these been taken strictly into the account, the sum total of the sale would have increased, possibly $1,000. In the North, we do not necessarily sell the harness with the horse. Why, in the South, should the clothes go with the Negro? In these sheds were the chattels huddled together on the floor, there being no sign of bench or table. They eat and slept on the bare boards, their food being rice and beans with occasionally a bit of bacon and cornbread. Their huge bundles were scattered over the floor, and thereon the slaves sat or reclined, when not restlessly moving about or gathered into sorrowful groups discussing the chances of their future fate. On the faces of all was an expression of heavy grief. Some appeared to be resigned to the hard stroke of fortune that had torn them from their homes and were sadly trying to make the best of it. Some sat brooding moodily over their sorrows, their chins resting on their hands, their eyes staring vacantly, and their bodies rocking to and fro with a restless motion that was never stilled. Few wept. The place was too public, and the drivers too near, though some occasionally turned aside to give way to a few quiet tears. They were dressed in every possible variety of uncouth and fantastic garb, in every style and of every imaginable color. The texture of the garments was in all cases coarse, most of the men being clothed in the rough cloth that's made expressly for the slaves. The dresses assumed by the Negro minstrels when they give imitations of plantation character are by no means exaggerated. They are, instead, weak and unable to come up to the original. There was every variety of hats with every imaginable slouch, and there was every cut and style of coat and pantaloons made with every conceivable ingenuity of misfit, and tossed on with a general appearance of perfect looseness that is perfectly indescribable, except to say that a Southern Negro always looks as if he could shake his clothes off without taking his hands out of his pockets. The women, true to the feminine instinct, had made in almost every case some attempt at finery. All wore gorgeous turbans, generally manufactured in an instant out of a gay-colored handkerchief by a sudden and graceful twist of the fingers. Though there was occasionally a more elaborate turban, a turban complex and mysterious, got up with care and ornamented with a few beads or bright bits of ribbon. Their dresses were mostly coarse stuff, though there were some gaudy calicos. A few had earrings, and one possessed the treasure of a string of yellow and blue beads. The little children were always better and more carefully dressed than the older ones, the parental pride coming out in the shape of a yellow cap pointed like a mitre, or a jacket with a strip of red broadcloth around the bottom. The children were of all sizes. The youngest, 15 days old. The babies were generally good-natured, though when one would set up a yell, the complaint soon attacked the others, and a full chorus would be the result. The slaves remained at the race course, some of them for more than a week, and all of them for 4 days before the sale. They were brought in thus early that buyers who desired to inspect them might enjoy that privilege, although none of them were sold at a private sale. For these preliminary days, their shed was constantly visited by speculators. The Negroes were examined with as little consideration as if they had been brutes indeed. The buyers pulling their mouths open to see their teeth, pinching their limbs to find how muscular they were, walking them up and down to detect any signs of lameness, making them stoop and bend in different ways that they might be certain there was no concealed rupture or wound. And in addition to all this treatment, asking them scores of questions relative to their qualifications and accomplishments. All these humiliations were submitted to without a murmur, and in some instances, with good-natured cheerfulness. Where the slave liked the appearance of a proposed buyer and fancied that he might prove a kind massa. The following curiously sad scene is the type of a score of others that were there enacted. Elijah, chattel number 5 in the catalog, had taken a fancy to a benevolent-looking middle-aged gentleman who was inspecting the stock, and thus used his power of persuasion to induce the benevolent man to purchase him with his wife, boy, and girl, Molly, Israel, and Savannah, chattels number 6, 7, and 8. The earnestness with which the poor fellow pressed his suit, knowing as he did that perhaps the happiness of his whole life depended on his success, was touching, and the arguments that he used most pathetic. He made no appeal to the feelings of the buyer. He rested no hope on his charity and kindness, but only strove to show how well worth his dollars were, the bone and blood he was entreating him to buy. Look at me, massa. I'm a prime rice planter. Sure you won't find a better man than me. No better on the whole plantation. Not a bit old yet. Do more work than ever. Do carpenter work too. Little better. Buy me, massa. I's be a good servant, massa. Molly too. My wife. Sir, first-rate rice hand. Most as good as me. Stand out here, Molly, and let the gentleman see. Molly advances, with her hands crossed on her bosom, and makes a short, quick curtsy and stands mute, looking appealingly in the benevolent man's face. But Elijah talks all the faster. Show massa your arm, Molly. Good arm, that massa. She do a heap of work more with that arm yet. Let good massa see your teeth, Molly. See that, massa? Teeth all regular, all good. She a young gal yet. Come out here, Israel. Walk around. Let the gentleman see how spry you be. Then, pointing to the 3-year-old girl who stood with her chubby hand to her mouth, holding on to her mother's dress, and uncertain what to make of the scene. Lil Vardy's only a child yet. Make a prime gal by and by. Better buy us, massa. We a first-rate bargain. And so on. But the benevolent gentleman found where he could drive a closer bargain, and so he bought somebody else. Similar scenes were transacting all the while on every side. Parents praising the strength and cleverness of their children, and showing off every muscle and sinew to the very best advantage. Not with the excusable pride of other parents, but to make them the more desirable in the eyes of the man buyer. And on the other hand, children excusing and mitigating the age and inability of their elderly parents, so that they might be more marketable and fall, if possible, into kind hands. Not unfrequently, these representations, if borne out by the facts, secured a purchaser. The women never spoke to the white men unless spoken to, and then made the conference as short as possible. And not one of them all, during the whole time they were thus exposed to the rude questions of vulgar men, spoke the first unwomanly or indelicate word, or conducted herself in any regard otherwise than as a modest woman should do. Their conversation and demeanor were quite as unexceptionable as they would have been had they had the highest ladies in the land. And through all the insults to which they were subjected, they conducted themselves with the most perfect decorum and self-respect. The sentiment of the subjoined characteristic dialogue was heard more than once repeated. Well, Colonel, I see you looking sharp at Shoemaker Bill's Sally. You gonna buy her? Well, Major, I think not. Sally's a good, big, strapping gal and can do a heap of work, but it's 5 years since she had any children. She's done breeding, I reckon. In the intervals of more active labor, the discussion of the reopening of the slave trade was commenced, and the opinion seemed to generally prevail that its re-establishment is a consummation devoutly to be wished. And one red-faced major or general or corporal clenched his remarks with the emphatic assertion that we'll have all the niggers in Africa over here in 3 years. We won't leave enough for seed. The sale. The race course at Savannah is situated about 3 miles from the city, in a pleasant spot, nearly surrounded by woods. As it rained violently during the 2 days of the sale, the place was only accessible by carriages, and the result was that few attended but actual buyers who had come from long distances and couldn't afford to lose the opportunity. If the affair had come off in Yankee Land, there would have been a dozen omnibuses running constantly between the city and the race course, and some speculator would have bagged a nice little sum of money by the operation. But nothing of the kind was thought of here, and the only gainers were the livery stables, the owners of which had sufficient Yankeeism to charge double and treble prices. The conveniences for getting to the ground were so limited that there weren't enough buyers to warrant the opening of the sale for an hour or two after the advertised time. They dropped in, however, a few at a time, and things began to look more encouragingly for the seller. The Negroes looked more uncomfortable than ever. The close confinement indoors for a number of days and the drizzly, unpleasant weather began to tell on their condition. They moved about more listlessly and were fast losing the activity and springiness they had at first shown. This morning they were all gathered into the long room of the building erected as the grandstand of the race course, that they might be immediately under the eyes of the buyers. The room was about 100 feet long by 20 wide, and herein were crowded the poor creatures, with much of their baggage, awaiting their respective calls to step up on the block and be sold to the highest bidder. This morning, Mr. Pierce Butler appeared among his people, speaking to each one and being recognized with seeming pleasure by all. The men obsequiously pulled off their hats and made that indescribable sliding hitch with the foot that passes with a Negro for a bow. And the women each dropped the quick curtsy, which they seldom vouchsafed to any other than their legitimate master or mistress. Occasionally, to a very old or favorite servant, Mr. Butler would extend his gloved hand, which mark of condescension was instantly hailed with grins of delight from all the sable witnesses. In answer to your question, Lauren, it was written by a journalist for the Tribune. I want to say the Chicago Tribune. The name is not here, but I'll try to find it. The document itself is almost 200 years old, right? The paper that I'm reading it from is brown. I'll continue. The room in which the sale actually took place immediately adjoined the room of the Negroes and communicated with it by 2 large doors. The sale room was open to the air on one side, commanding a view of the entire course. A small platform was raised about 2.5 feet high, on which were placed the desks of the entry clerks, leaving room in front of them for the auctioneer and the goods. At about 11 o'clock, the businessmen took their places and announced that the sale would begin. Mr. Bryan, the Negro broker, a dapper little man wearing spectacles and a yachting hat, sharp and sudden in his movements, and perhaps the least bit in the world obtrusively officious, as earnest in his language as he could be without actual swearing, though acting much as if he would like to swear a little at the critical moment. Mr. Bryant didn't sell the goods. He merely superintended the operation and saw that the entry clerks did their duty properly. The auctioneer proper was Mr. Walsh, who deserves a word of description. In personal appearance, he's the very opposite of Mr. Bryan, being careless in his dress instead of scrupulous, a large man instead of a little one, a fat man instead of a lean one, and a good-natured man instead of a fierce one. He's a rollicking old boy, with an eye ever on the lookout, and that never lets a bidding nod escape him, a hearty word for every bidder who cares for it, and plenty of jokes to let off when the business gets a little slack. Mr. Walsh has a florid complexion, not more so perhaps than is becoming, and possibly not more so than is natural in a whiskey country. Not only is his face red, but his skin has been taken off in spots by blisters of some sort, giving him a peely look, so that, taking his face all in all, the peeliness and the redness combined, he looks much as if he had been boiled in the same pot with a red cabbage. Mr. Walsh mounted the stand and announced the terms of the sale. 1/3 cash, the remainder payable in 2 equal annual installments, bearing interest from the day of the sale, and to be secured by approved mortgages and personal security, or approved acceptances in Savannah, Georgia, or Charleston, South Carolina. So 1/3 down. Slave is $50,000. You got to put down, 17, 18, right? The buyers who were present, to the number of about 200, clustered around the platform, while the Negroes, who were not likely to be immediately wanted, gathered into sad groups in the background to watch the progress of the selling in which they were so sorrowfully interested. The wind howled outside, and through the open side of the building, the driving rain came pouring in. The bar downstairs ceased for a short time its brisk trade. The buyers lit fresh cigars, got ready their catalogues and their pencils, and the first lot of human chattels was let up on the stand, not by a white man, but by a sleek mulatto, himself a slave, and who seems to regard the selling of his brethren, in which he so glibly assists, as a capital joke. It had been announced that the Negroes would be sold in families. That is to say, a man would not be parted from his wife, or a mother from a very young child. This is perhaps as much policy as humanity in this arrangement, for thereby many aged and unserviced people are disposed of who otherwise would not find a ready sale. I'm going to pause here to expound on this so we're clear. So the reason for insisting that families be sold together is so that if you choose strong, healthy stock, you have to take their elderly mother too, or their elderly father too. It's helping them to make sure that all of the best stock is not sold and they're stuck with only the tiny babies and the really old people. I'll continue. The first family brought out were announced on the catalog as 1. George, 27, prime cotton planter. My son is 27. 2. Sue, 26, prime rice planter. 3. George, 6, boy child. 4. Harry, 2 years old, boy child. The manner of buying was announced to be bidding a certain price apiece for the whole lot. Thus, George and his family were started at $300, which would have been $300 apiece, right? So when you raise, if you raise to $350, you're raising to $350 apiece, not on one. That's the way they did it. And so George and his family were started at $300 and were finally sold at $600 each, bringing $2,400 for the 4. So we're talking about $80,000 in today's money. So to get an idea of the relative value of each one, we must suppose George worth $1,200, because that is the typical price of an able-bodied male slave with a skill, right? So now if he made up half of it, Sue maybe $900, little George might have been $200, Harry maybe $100. Owing, however, to some misapprehension on the part of the buyer as to the manner of bidding, he didn't take the family at this figure, and they were put up and sold again on the second day, when they brought this time $620 each, or $2,480 for the whole, an advance of $80 over the last sale. Robert and Luna, his wife, were announced as having goiter, otherwise very prime, which brought the round sum of $1,005 each. But that your readers may have an idea of the exact manner in which things are done, I am appending a couple of pages of the catalog used on this occasion. Now I'm going to read this through to you. It's long, but I think that their names are worth speaking. So I'm going to go through the list. Might be 20 of them, 30 of them. All right, number 99, Kate's John, aged 30, Rice, prime man. Betsy, 29, Rice, unsound. Wonder what they meant by that. Kate, 6 years old. Violet, 3 months old. Sold, $510 each. Next, Wooster, 45, Rice hand and fair mason. Mary, 40, cotton hand. Sold, $300 each. Linda, 19, cotton, prime young woman. Joe, 13, rice, prime boy. Sold, $300 each. Bob, 30, rice. Mary, 25, rice, prime woman. Sold for $1,135 each. That's about $45,000 in today's money, right? Anson, 49, ruptured one eye. Violet, 55, sold for $250 each. Alan Jeffrey, rice hand and Sawyer in steam mill. Psyche, 43, rice hand. And Waddy, 5 years old with infirm legs. Sold $520 each. Joe, 3 months old. Dorcas, 17 years old, prime woman. Judy, 11, cotton, prime girl. $1,200 each. And the list goes on. It seems as if every shade of character capable of being implicated in the sale of human flesh and blood was represented among the buyers. There was the Georgia fast young man with his pantaloons stuck into his boots, his velvet cap jauntily dragged over to one side, and his cheek full of tobacco, which he bites from a huge plug, that resembles more than anything an old bit of a rusty wagon tire, and he's altogether an animal of quite a different breed from your New York fast man. What was that they were saying about them Northerners? Yeah, okay. His ready revolver or his convenient knife is ready for instant use in case of a heated argument. White neckcloth, gold-speckled and silver-haired old men were there, resembling in appearance that noxious breed of sanctimonious deacon we have in the North, who are perpetually leaving documents at your door that you never read, and the business of whose mendicant life it is to eternally solicit subscriptions for charitable associations of which they are treasurers. These gentry, with quiet step and subdued voice, moved carefully about among the livestock, ignoring as a general rule the men, but tormenting the women with questions which, when accidentally overheard by the disinterested spectator, bred in that spectator's mind an almost irresistible desire to knock somebody down. And then all imaginable varieties of rough backwood rowdies, who began the day in a spirited manner, but who, as its hours progressed, and their practice at the bar became more prolific in results, waxed louder and talkier and more violent, were present, and added a characteristic feature to the assemblage. Those of you who have read Uncle Tom, and who's not, will remember with peculiar feelings Legree, the slave driver and woman whipper, that character is not been overdrawn or too highly colored. There's abundant testimony. Witness the subjoined dialogue. A party of men are conversing on the fruitful subject of managing refractory niggers. Some were for severe whipping, some recommended branding, one or two advocated other modes of torture, but one huge brute of a man who had not taken an active part in the discussion except to agree with an approving nod to any unusually barbarous proposition, at last broke his silence by saying in an oracular way, "You may say what you like about managing niggers. I'm a driver myself, and I've had some experience, and I ought to know. You can manage ordinary niggers by licking 'em and giving 'em a taste of the hot iron once in a while when they're extra ugly. But if a nigger really sets himself up against me, I can't never have any patience with him. I just get my pistol and shoot him right down, and that's the best way." And this brute was talking to gentlemen, and his remarks were listened to with attention, and his assertions assented to by more than one in the knot of listeners. But all this time, the sale was going on, and the merry Mr. Walsh, with many a quip and jest, was beguiling the time when the bidding was slow. The expression on the faces of all who stepped on the block was always the same, and told of more anguish than it is in the power of words to express. Blighted homes, crushed hopes, and broken hearts was the sad story to be read in all the anxious faces. Some of them regarded the sale with perfect indifference, never making a motion, save to turn from one side to the other at the word of the dapper Mr. Bryan, that all the crowd might have a fair view of their proportions, and then, when the sale was accomplished, stepped down from the block without caring to cast even a look at the buyer, who now held all their happiness in his hands. Others, again, strained their eyes with eager glances from one buyer to another as the bidding went on, trying with earnest attention to follow the rapid voice of the auctioneer. Sometimes 2 persons only would be bidding for the same chattel, all the others having resigned the contest. And then the poor creature on the block, conceiving an instantaneous preference for one of the buyers over the other, would regard the rivalry with the intensest interest, the expression of his face changing with every bid, settling into a half smile of joy if the favorite buyer persevered until the end and secured the property, and settling down into a look of hopeless despair if the other won the victory. Daphne's baby. The family of Primus, plantation carpenter, consisting of Daphne, his wife, with her younger babe, and Dido, a girl of 3 years old, were reached in due course of time. Daphne had a large shawl which she kept carefully wrapped around her infant and herself. This unusual proceeding attracted much attention and provoked many remarks, such as these: "What do you keep your nigger covered up for? Pull off her blanket. What's the matter with the gal? Has she got the headache? What's the fault of the gal? Ain't she sound? Pull off her rags and let us see her. Who's gonna bid on that nigger if you keep her covered up? Let's see her face." And a loud chorus of similar remarks, emphasized with profanity and mingled with sayings too indecent and obscene to even be hinted at here, went up from the crowd of chivalrous Southern gentlemen. At last the auctioneer obtained a hearing long enough to explain that there was no attempt to practice any deception in the case. The parties were not to be wronged in any way. He had no desire to palm off on them an inferior article. But the truth of the matter was that Daphne only gave birth 15 days ago, and he thought that On that account, she was entitled to the slight indulgence of a blanket to keep herself and the child away from the chill air and the driving rain. Will your lady readers look at the circumstances of this case? The day was the 2nd of March. Daphne's baby was born into the world on St. Valentine's happy day, the 14th of February. Since her confinement, since childbirth, Daphne had traveled from the plantation to Savannah, where she'd been kept in a shed for 6 days. On the 6th or 7th day, after her sickness, she had left her bed, taken a railroad journey across the country to the shambles. There, exposed for 6 days to the questionings and insults of the Negro speculators, and then on the 15th day after childbirth, was put up on the block with her husband and oldest child and with her newborn baby in her arms and sold to the highest bidder. It was very considerate of Daphne to give birth before the sale. Her wailing babe was worth to Mr. Butler all of $100. The family sold for $625 apiece, or $2,500 for the 4. Next, there was Bob and Mary. This was a couple not quite a year married and were down in the catalog as prime. They had no children yet. Mary, with a reprehensible lack of that tender interest in Mr. Butler's affairs that had been exhibited in so eminent a degree by Daphne, had disappointed that worthy man's expectations, and the baby was as yet not. But Bob and Mary sold for $1,135 apiece for all that. In another instance, Margaret, the wife of Dr. George, who was confined on February 16th, who gave birth on February 16th, though the name of herself and family were inserted into the catalog, did not come to the sale, and consequently were not disposed of at all. As Margaret's baby was fully 4 days old at the time she was required to start on her journey to Savannah, we can only look at her refusal to go as a most culpable instance of perseverity and of perversity. Mary was whipped and branded and otherwise kindly admonished of her great sin in thus disappointing the reasonable expectations of so kind a master. But Mr. Butler bore with her in a truly Christian spirit and uttered no reproach, in public at least. It was the more unkind of Margaret, too, because there were 6 in the family who would have brought probably $4,000, and all were detained by the sale, by the contumacy of misguided Margaret. While on the subject of babies, it may be mentioned that Amity, chattel number 316, wife of Prince, chattel number 315, had testified her earnest desire to contribute all in her power to the worldly wealth of her master by bringing into the world at one time chattels number 317 and 318, being a fine pair of twin boys just a year old. It's not in evidence that Amity received from her master any testimonial of his appreciating her good behavior on this occasion, but it's certain that she brought a great price. The 4, Prince, Amity, and the twins, selling for $670 apiece, being a total of $2,680. Many other babies, of all ages of babyhood, were sold, but there was nothing particularly interesting about them. There were some 30 babies in the lot. Their esteemed worth to the master $100 on the day they're born, and to increase in value by $100 per year until they are 16 or 17 years old, at which age they bring the best prices. The love story of Jeffrey and Dorcas. Jeffrey, chattel number 319, marked as a prime cotton hand, aged 23, was put up. Jeffrey being a likely lad, the competition was high. Jeffrey was sold alone. The first bid was $1,100. He was finally sold for $1,310. He had no encumbrance in the shape of an aged father or mother who must necessarily be sold with him. He had no children, for Jeffrey wasn't married. But Jeffrey, chattel number 319, being human in his affections, had dared to cherish a love for Dorcas, number 278. And Dorcas, not having the fear of her master before her eyes, had given her heart to Jeffrey. Whether what followed was a just retribution on Jeffrey and Dorcas for daring to take such liberties with their master's property as to exchange hearts, or whether it only goes to prove that with black as with white, as the saying holds, the course of true love will never run smooth, cannot now be told. Certain it is that these two lovers were not to realize the consummation of their hopes in happy wedlock. Jeffrey and Dorcas had told their loves, had exchanged their simple vows, and were betrothed, each to the other as dear, and each by the other as fondly beloved as though their skins had been of fairer color. And who shall say that in the sight of heaven and all holy angels that these two humble hearts were not as closely wedded as any two of the prouder race that call them slaves? But that as it may be, Jeffrey was sold. He finds out his new master, and hat in hand, big tears standing in his eyes, and his voice trembling with emotion, he stands before that master and tells his simple story, praying that his betrothed may be bought with him. Though his voice trembles, there's no embarrassment in his manner. His fears have killed all the bashfulness that would naturally attend such a recital to a stranger and before unsympathetic witnesses. He feels that he's pleading for the happiness of her he loves as well as for his own. And his tale is told in a frank and manly way. I loves Dorcas, young massa. I loves her well and true. She says she loves me, and I know she does. The good Lord knows I loves her better than I loves anyone in the whole wide world. Never can love another woman half so well. Please buy Dorcas, massa. We'll be good servants to you, long as we live. We'll be married right soon, young massa, and the children will be healthy and strong, massa, and they be good servants too. Please buy Dorcas, young massa. We loves each other a heap. Do. Really true, massa. Jeffrey then remembers that no loves and hopes of his are to enter into the bargain at all. But in the earnestness of his love, he's forgotten to base his plea on other ground until now, when he bethinks and continues with his voice not trembling, save with eagerness to prove how worthy of many dollars is the maiden of his heart. He goes on. Young massa, Dorcas is a prime woman. A1, sir. Tall gal, sir. Long arms, strong, healthy, and can do a heap of work in a day. She one of the best rice hands on the whole plantation. Worth $1,200 easy, massa. First rate bargain at that. The man seems touched by Jeffrey's last remarks and bids him to fetch out his gal and let's see what she looks like. Jeffrey goes into the long room and presently returns with Dorcas, looking very sad and self-possessed without a particle of embarrassment at the trying position in which she's placed. She makes the accustomed curtsy and stands meekly with her hands clasped across her bosom, waiting the result. The buyer regards her with a critical eye and growls in a low voice, "This gal has good points." And then he goes on to a more minute and careful examination of her working abilities. He turns her around, makes her stoop and walk. Then he takes off her turban to look at her head, that no disease or wound be concealed by the colorful handkerchief. He looks at her teeth, feels of her arms, and at last announces himself pleased with the results of his observations, whereat Geoffrey, who has stood near, trembling with eager hope, is overjoyed, and he smiles for the first time. The buyer then crowns Geoffrey's happiness by making a promise that he will buy her if the price is not run up too high. And the two lovers step aside and congratulate each other on their good fortune. But Dorcas is not to be sold until the next day, and there are 24 long hours of feverish expectation. Early next morning is Geoffrey alert, and hat in hand, encouraged to unusual freedom by the greatness of the stake for which he plays. He addresses every buyer, and of all who will listen, he begs the boon of a word to be spoken to his new master to encourage him to buy Dorcas. And all along the morning, he speaks in his homely way with all who know him, that they'll intercede to save his sweetheart from being sold away from him forever. No one has the heart to deny a word of promise and encouragement to the poor fellow, and joyous with so much kindness, his hopes and spirits gradually rise until he feels almost certain that the wish of his heart will be accomplished. And Dorcas, too, is smiling, for is not Geoffrey's happiness her own? At last comes the trying moment, and Dorcas steps up on the stand. But now, a most unexpected feature in the drama is for the first time unmasked. Dorcas is not to be sold alone, but with the family of 4 others. Full of dismay, Geoffrey looks to his master, who shakes his head. For although he might be induced to buy Dorcas alone, he has no use for the rest of the family. Geoffrey reads his doom in his master's look and turns away, the tears streaming down his honest face. And so Dorcas is sold, and her toiling life is to be spent in the cotton fields of South Carolina, while Geoffrey goes to the rice plantations of the Great Swamp. And tomorrow Geoffrey and Dorcas are to say their tearful farewells and go their separate ways in life, to meet no more as mortal beings. But didn't Mr. Pierce Butler give them a silver dollar apiece? Who's to say there's no magnanimity in slave owners? In another hour, I see Dorcas in the long room, sitting motionless as a statue, with her head covered with a shawl. And I see Geoffrey, who goes to his new master and pulls off his hat and says, "I's very much obliged, massa, for you trying to help me. I knows you would have done it if you could. Thanks you, massa. Thank you. But it's very hard." And here the poor fellow breaks down entirely and walks away, covering his face with his battered hat and sobbing like a child. He's soon surrounded by a group of his colored friends who, with an instinctive delicacy most unlooked for, stand quiet and with uncovered heads about him. Anson and Violet, chattels number 111 and 112, were sold for $250 each, both being old and Anson being down in the catalog as having ruptured and having one eye. Violet was sold as being sick. Her disease was probably consumption, which supposition gave rise to the following conversation between two buyers. Cheap gal, that, Major? I don't think so. They may talk about her being sick. It's no easy sickness she's got. She got consumption. And the man that buys her will have to be a doctor in her all the time, and she'll die in less than 3 months. I won't have anything to do with her. I don't want no half-dead niggers around me. The market value of an eye. Guy, chattel number 419, a prime young man, sold for $1,280, being without blemish. His age was 20 years, and he was altogether a fine article. His next door neighbor, Andrew, chattel number 420, was his very counterpart in all marketable points in size, age, and skill, and everything except that he had lost his right eye. Andrew sold for $1,040, from which we argue that the market value of the right eye in the southern country is $240. When the family of Mingo, consisting of his wife, 2 sons, and a daughter, was called for, it was announced by the auctioneer that chattel number 322, Dembo, the eldest son, aged 20, had the evening before procured the services of a minister and had been joined in wedlock to chattel number 404, Francis, and that he should be compelled to put up the bride and groom in one lot. They were called up, and as was to be expected, their appearance was the signal for a volley of coarse jokes from the auctioneer and of ribald remarks from the standing crowd. The newly married pair bore it bravely, although one refined gentleman took hold of Francis's lips and pulled them apart to see her age. This sort of thing it is that makes northern blood boil and northern fists clench with a laudable desire to hit somebody. It was almost too much for endurance to stand and see those brutal slave drivers pushing the women about, pulling their lips apart with their not too cleanly hands, and committing many other indecent acts, while the husbands, fathers, and brothers of those women were compelled to witness these things without the power to resent the outrage. Dembo and Francis were at last struck off for $1,320 each and went to spend their honeymoon on a cotton plantation in Alabama. Next, we have the case of Joshua's Molly. The auctioneer brought up Joshua's Molly and family. He announced that Molly insisted that she was lame in her left foot and perversely would walk lame, although for his part, he didn't believe a word of it. He had caused her to be examined by an eminent physician in Savannah, which medical light had declared that Joshua's Molly was not lame, that she was only shamming. However, the gentlemen must judge for themselves and bid accordingly. So Molly was put through her paces and compelled to trot up and down along the stage, to go up and down the steps, and to exercise her feet in various ways, but always with the same result. The left foot would be lame. She was finally sold for $695. Whether she was really lame or not, no one knows but herself. But it must be remembered that to a slave, a lameness or anything that decreases his market value is a thing to be rejoiced over. A man in the prime of life, worth $1,600 or thereabouts, can have little hope of ever being able to purchase his liberty by savings of his own. But let him have a rupture, or lose a limb, or sustain an injury that renders him of much less service to his owner and reduces his value to $300 or $400, he may hope to accumulate that sum and eventually to purchase his liberty. Freedom without health is infinitely sweeter than health without freedom. And so the great sale went on for 2 long days, during which time there were sold 429 men, women, and children. There were 436 announced to be sold, but a few were detained on the plantation by sickness. At the close of the sale, on the last day, several baskets of champagne were produced, and all were invited to partake, the wine being at the expense of the broker, Mr. Bryan. The total amount of the sale foots up $303,000, $850. The proceeds of the first day being $161,480, and of the second day, $142,370. Now I'm going to pause here to give you the market value of that sale, so that you understand what the total amount is that we are working with. All right, let me just take a quick look. My God. Hold on. This got to be wrong. This can't be right. We're talking millions of dollars. This can't be right. Anyway, I'm going to try it. 9,166,912.11 in 2018 dollars. So the totality of the sale was upwards of $9 million in today's money. I'll continue. The highest sum paid for any one family was given for Sally Walker and her 5 children, who were mostly grown up. The price was $6,180. The highest price paid for a single man was $1,750, which was given for William, a fair carpenter and caulker. The highest price paid for a woman was $1,250, which was given for Jane, cotton hand, and house servant. The lowest price paid was for Anson and Violet, a gray-haired couple, each having numbered more than 50 years, and they brought $250 apiece. So just to put that in today's money, the cheapest slave sold for just under $8,000, and the most expensive slave sold for approximately $55,000 for his carpentry skills. Leaving the race buildings, where the scenes we have described took place, a crowd of Negroes were seen gathered eagerly around a white man. That man was Pierce M. Butler of the Free City of Philadelphia, who was solacing the wounded hearts of the people he had sold from their firesides and their homes by doling out to them small change at the rate of $1 a head. To every Negro he had sold, who presented his claim for the paltry pittance, he gave the munificent stipend of $1 whole. He being provided with 2 canvas bags of 25-cent pieces fresh from the mint, so he could give some glitter to his generosity. And now come the scenes of the last partings, of the final separations of those who were akin, or those who had been such dear friends from youth that no ties of kindred could bind them closer, of those who were all in all to each other. And for those whose bleeding hearts there shall be no earthly comfort, the parting of parents and children, of brother from brother, and the rending of sister from a sister's bosom, and oh, hardest, cruelest of all, the tearing asunder of loving hearts wedded in all save the one ceremony of the church. These scenes pass all description. It's not meet for pen to meddle with tears so holy. As the last family stepped down from the block, the rain stopped, and for the first time in 4 days, the clouds broke away, and the soft sunlight fell on the scene. The unhappy slaves had, many of them, already been removed, and others were now departing with their new masters. That night, not a steamer left that southern port, not a train of cars sped away from that cruel city that didn't bear each its own sad burden of those unhappy ones whose only crime is that they're not strong and wise. Some of them maimed and wounded, some scarred and gashed by accident or by the hand of ruthless drivers. All sad and sorrowful as human hearts can be. But the stars shone out as brightly as if such things had never been, and the blushing fruit trees poured their fragrance on the evening air, and the scene was as calmly sweet and quiet as if man had never marred the glorious beauties of earth by deeds of cruelty and wrong. End. All right, so I hope you enjoyed that. That was the entirety of the article, is actually what it is. It's bound now. The date is in the caption. I hope it was useful. You know, we all know that there were slave auctions, but we are not taught, or we don't teach each other the on-the-ground narrative. You know what I mean? How this happened, how this went down, what this looked like. And so this is a small peek into that, you know, to add to the body of knowledge. So I hope you find it useful. As you know, I love you with all my heart. And I'll be back with another reading real soon. Much, much love. Peace out.